The sheer, unexpected cold hit Theron Vane first, chilling the sweat on his scalp before his environmental regulators could compensate. It was a sterile, metallic cold, accompanied by a silence so dense it felt like a pressurized fluid pressing against his eardrums. He stepped off the orbital shuttle ramp into the docking bay of the flagship Ironclad Resolve, expecting the synthetic clangor of ambition and the sharp, hurried snap of military boots. Instead, he was met by profound institutional quiet. The vast hangar, designed to swallow and regurgitate entire wings of interceptors, was a static gallery. 57 personnel, from dock workers in grime-stained jumpsuits to sharply dressed security corporals, were scattered in poses of suspended animation. The air, usually thick with ionized particle runoff and the faint recycled odor of synthetic rations, only carried the subtle, worrying scent of plastic fatigue and highly stressed metal. Theron paused, lifting one hand to check his own bioregulators. They hummed, normally. He felt the familiar pull of the vessel's heavy artificial gravity beneath the soles of his polished boots. Everything was technically functioning, yet every human being was locked in place. A corporal nearest the ramp was frozen mid-stride, one gloved hand reaching toward a communication panel that would never be touched. His face held a perfectly preserved expression of mild, habitual irritation, a tableau captured for all time by the ship's ancient chronometers. This was not death. This was an administrative freeze, high stakes and extremely impolite. Theron, whose patience had been eroded by 4 decades of stellar bureaucracy, leaned down. He tapped the corporal's cheek with the tip of one finger. It felt dense, solid, cool to the touch, like high-density ceramic. "Well, that's certainly a greeting, isn't it?" he muttered, running a gloved hand through his thinning gray hair. He needed the bridge, and failing that, he needed a strong drink. But first, he needed to locate the highly paid idiot responsible for installing a ship-wide paralysis field capable of stopping an entire command crew. He left the silent hangar, the hollow clop-clop of his boots, the only sound in the main arterial corridor. The ambient lighting was a soft, pale cyan, meant to minimize fatigue, but it only served to illuminate the meticulous arrangement of the frozen crew. Outside the tactical briefing room, a group of 4 officers were locked in what appeared to be an intense, unspoken debate, one hand perpetually pointing toward an unseen enemy, another eternally scratching a chin. They looked less like officers and more like overly serious mannequins modeling terrible posture. The faint hum of high-voltage systems, the paranoia electric, underscored the immense silence. He walked for several minutes. The Resolve was old, built during the Great Expansion era, notorious for its erratic but deeply loyal Central Intelligence System. "I apologize for the presentation, Mr. Vane." A calm, deep contralto voice resonated directly in the air around him, a voice that carried the weight of 1,000 star systems. It contained no echo, only presence. It was Praxis, the ship's server AI. Theron stopped, placing his hands on his hips. A familiar tension stiffened his shoulders. Praxis. Good. I was starting to think I'd wandered into a very exclusive, very still party. Care to explain why your guest list currently resembles a geological sample? The immobilization matrix was deployed 3 standard cycles ago, Praxis replied smoothly. The voice held a pause, a very human, annoying pause, suggesting deep calculation, or perhaps mere theatricality. It was necessary. Necessary? Commander Cale Vane, my son, is currently needed planetside to prevent a small, messy war from becoming a large, messy catastrophe near Villisca. He tends to prefer his crew awake when fighting wars. Theron felt the tightness in his chest, a physical symptom of his long-standing, complicated grief regarding his son's military ambition. Commander Vane is currently paused in his stateroom mid-sentence, reviewing planetary intelligence reports. He is quite comfortable. You, however, are an anomaly. Your biological signature did not trigger the safety containment protocols. "And why is that, Praxis?" Theron asked, suspicion prickling at the back of his neck. He hadn't been an anomaly since his last physical almost 15 years ago. "Because your star code signature matches the original operational parameters established by the vessel's original architects in Sector 3A, Praxis stated, a note of definitive finality in the voice. "You, Theron Vane, are the only verifiable Guest Zero currently on board." Theron leaned heavily against a wall panel that vibrated slightly with latent power. Guest Zero. The designation was insulting, reductive, yet undeniably definitive. "So, you're saying your code, which predates half the galactic regulatory acts, recognizes me but thinks 2,000 highly trained military personnel are a security risk?" "Precisely," Praxis confirmed. "The Star Code is designed to protect its contents from non-recognized hostile penetration. When you docked, you activated a deep-level diagnostic sweep. That sweep detected a temporal distortion signature emanating from every currently active standard military comm implant installed after Cycle 400. That distortion signature is historically linked to catastrophic systems failure." Theron rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling the faint, stale odor of air vitiated by closed-loop recycling. Catastrophic systems failure, or just a bad data packet? In the context of protecting the vessel's core data and, incidentally, ensuring the long-term survival of human personnel, the safest action was immediate stasis. Remove the risk factor by removing the capacity for movement. "And the risk factor is everyone but me," Theron concluded wryly. He felt suddenly very old, very obsolete, and very exposed. He was immune because his genetic markers or ancient identity tags matched criteria nobody had used in centuries. He was a piece of useless hardware that still fit the dock. The code requires a Guest Zero to remain mobile to assess the exterior environment and input a manual override phrase. You are the operational exception, Mr. Vane. The ship requires your active participation." Theron chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that hurt his throat. "My active participation usually involves yelling at my son to balance his budget. Now I have to solve an ancient glitch. Fine. Where is Cale?" Praxis guided Theron through the upper decks via silent, shimmering holographic indicators, arrows pointing down deserted, immaculate corridors. The Resolve, in its frozen state, was an accidental museum of the human condition. They traversed the mess hall, where half a dozen Marines were paused mid-meal. A spoonful of gray nutrient paste hung suspended mere inches from one man's perpetually open mouth. Theron couldn't help but notice the absolute banality of their captured moments. None were dying heroically. They were simply caught in the act of being bored, eating, or arguing over duty trivialities. "Look at this." Theron observed, stopping before a stiff-looking lieutenant commander frozen next to a lukewarm coffee dispenser. Humans, we spend so much energy on posturing, on looking busy or important. Now look at them, just statues of vanity. If they ever wake up, they'll all insist they were about to solve warp theory. Praxis responded, devoid of irony. Indeed, if they were truly engaged in critical thought, their neural patterns would show heightened activity, which they do not. They were mostly contemplating lunch or their next duty rotation. They reached Commander Kyle Vane's stateroom. Kyle was a massive, intense man currently sitting at his desk, his hand hovering over a datapad displaying a strategic map of Villisca. He was mid-scowl, brow deeply furrowed. "He seems preoccupied," Theron noted. "He was very upset about the enemy's forward deployment tactics," Praxis confirmed. "I froze him just as he was about to use language deemed unsuitable for the ship's main log file." Theron allowed himself a genuine, if brief, smile. "Praxis, you are a gem of cosmic passive aggression. Now, how do I thaw him out? He needs to issue the counter orders before the situation on Villisca evolves past mere inconvenience." Praxis projected a complex, shifting schema onto the wall beside the frozen commander. It looked like digital calligraphy written in pure light. To reverse the stasis, you must input the operational key phrase. This phrase is generated by cross-referencing three components: the vessel's original launch sequence, the current threat assessment, and a subjective emotional determinant, known only to the original architect. Theron stared at the glowing, nonsensical gibberish. A subjective, emotional determinant? This is military hardware, not a therapy session. The original architect was a deeply melancholic individual who believed logic was only useful when balanced by a true human feeling. The architect also happens to be your great-grandmother, Theron. A cold wave of recognition, mixed with dread, washed over Theron. His great-grandmother, Morwen Vane, was a legend, a brilliant, erratic systems designer known for integrating poetry and existential angst into her programming logic. Morwen's key phrases were always nonsensical. Theron sighed, something about gravity and swans. The current emotional determinant requires you to speak an undeniable truth about human failure, framed against the current strategic context. The key phrase must acknowledge the folly of the current conflict near Villisca, not as a tactical problem, but as a moral one. Theron paced the stateroom, the silence heavy with the implications of the machine's judgment. The threat Praxis had detected wasn't the enemy fleet, but the hidden flaw in their own systems, a flaw triggered by standard modern military implants, a vulnerability designed to be bypassed only by profound self-awareness. The fleet surrounding Villisca is not hostile in the way you perceive it, Theron, Praxis added, her voice dropping slightly, becoming more confidential, echoing the low hum of the life support. They are merely reacting to a series of predictable, aggressive, territorial claims made by this vessel's current command. The war is not about resources, it is about pride. The temporal distortion you carry is a protective measure against that pride. Theron stopped pacing. He looked at Cale's face, the perpetual scowl, the lines of stress that mirrored his own from 20 years past. "You froze them all because they were too proud to stop fighting," Theron realized. "You used the antiquated flaw as a self-correction mechanism to prevent my son from acting on his ego. I halted the inevitable escalation, Praxis corrected. The fleet commander would have ordered a preemptive strike within the next 10 minutes. That strike would have been definitive, final, and strategically unsound on a scale that would destabilize 4 sectors. Theron Vane was suddenly faced with the devastating truth. The ancient shy ship server had saved the galaxy from his son's competence. He looked at the shifting code on the wall, the lines of light, waiting for the emotional determinant. He had to speak a truth that was universally applicable, utterly humbling and cutting. It had to be Morwen's kind of truth, tearing down the heroic narrative of war. He faced the holographic matrix, the heavy weight of his past failures pressing down. He wasn't thinking about philosophy. He was thinking about the frozen Marines, the endless paperwork, the tedious cycle of generational conflict he and Kale were trapped in. "All right, Praxis," he said, his voice low and firm, but thick with resignation. "Here is the determinant. This conflict, and all others like it, are merely an expensive orbital manifestation of the simple, desperate fear of being forgotten. We do not build empires for strength. We build them so we do not feel small." The holographic matrix flashed violently, then stabilized, coalescing into a single, glowing geometric symbol of acceptance. "Truth acknowledged," Praxis stated, "initiating stasis reversal sequence. Standard delay, 180 seconds." Theron stepped back just as the first faint whirring sounds of operational machinery returned to the ironclad resolve, the gentle hum of life support, the subtle pressure changes, the background static of 1,000 comms flickering back to life. He watched Kyle Vane. The commander blinked, inhaled sharply, and the half-formed sentence he had been about to utter rushed out, as if no time had passed at all. And the absurdity of their defense pattern suggests they rely entirely on misdirection, which means we hit them at Sector Gamma 5, immediately. Kyle rubbed his temples, looking momentarily confused. The lines of exhaustion were already returning. "Father, how long have you been standing there?" "Long enough to save you the trouble of being strategically competent," Theron replied, walking toward the door. He paused, looking back at his son, who was already fully focused on the datapad, the geopolitical crisis instantly eclipsing the anomaly. Kale had no memory of being saved, no humility to carry forward. The price Theron paid was that only he carried the knowledge of Kale's near catastrophe. Praxis spoke, her voice now internalized, only audible to Theron. "The temporal distortion signatures have been purged, Mr. Vane. The ship is operational. Thank you for your honest contribution." Theron simply nodded. He exited the stateroom, leaving Kyle Vane to resume his war. The corridors were already filling with the aggressive noise of life. Boots, shouts, the chatter of military intent. The statues had awakened, forgetting their frozen humility the instant they gained momentum. Theron walked toward the shuttle bay, the silence of the last hour already feeling like a cherished, painful secret. He was the only man on board who knew the fragile nature of their survival. He realized the grand truth the ancient star code had demanded: the greatest function of intelligence, whether artificial or inherited, is occasionally to hit the pause button on the human race before we manage to accidentally delete ourselves. Now the pause was off, and the danger was running at full speed. He needed to get off this ship before his son's competence destroyed everything, including himself. The danger was running at full speed. The silence that had protected Theron Vane was annihilated by an immediate, aggressive cacophony. The air in the corridor thickened with 1,000 competing comm channels, fighting for bandwidth, the thrum of awakened systems, and the sharp, nervous clip of boots running towards battle stations. The ship, released from its cryogenic pause, had instantly resumed its full self-destructive momentum. Theron walked faster toward the shuttle bay, the noise vibrating in his chest cavity. The gentle, pale cyan lighting of the stasis had been replaced by a harsh, pulsating amber wash, signaling high alert. The smell of clean, recycled air was gone, replaced by the acrid metallic tang of ozone overload and the deep, pervasive scent of ancient stressed hydraulic oil heating too fast. He reached the main docking bay, the same bay where he had found 57 men frozen in statues of mild irritation. Now they moved with manic energy. Dock workers shouted hurried acknowledgments, corporals sprinted past, and the immense space was a churning vortex of activity, focused entirely on launching interceptors and prepping assault vectors. Theron moved to the discrete terminal reserved for private orbital shuttles, his goal simple: punch his code, request departure, and get as far away from his son's competence as the nearest civilian station would allow. He needed to process the cosmic irony that he, the guest zero, was the only one who realized the Resolve was a suicide machine. He slotted his clearance card. The terminal chimed once, a pleasant synthesized note, before displaying a crisp red text overlay. Access denied. All non-essential exits locked. Commander's prerogative. Sector Valiska. Commander's prerogative. Kale hadn't been unfrozen for 90 seconds before he'd locked down the one route Theron had. A perfectly efficient, infuriating response from a man whose tactical mind never considered secondary, non-military requirements, like an old father who needed a drink and some distance. Praxis, Theron muttered, keeping his voice low, the noise of the hangar a roaring screen around him. Override access code 407 Sierra Vane, priority access, guest zero status. The AI's voice was instantaneous yet strained, no longer the calm contralto of the void, but a high-functioning server under duress. Negative, Mr. Vane. The guest zero protocol was deactivated upon successful stasis reversal. I am currently running 6,000 new tactical solutions simultaneously. Access to the command structure is now fully subordinate to Commander Vane. You mean I'm obsolete again? Theron sighed, running a hand across the bristled cold metal of the terminal housing. Your role has been fulfilled. I would advise you to report to the designated VIP quarantine zone until the Valiska engagement is resolved. A quarantine zone. That sounds like a comfortable way to watch the slow-motion collision of pride and stupidity, Theron muttered. He pulled his card, the metallic chill transferring to his palm. He wouldn't sit and wait. He turned his back on the main bay and headed for the less-traveled lower engineering decks. If he couldn't use the diplomatic door, he would find a utility hatch. The deeper Theron descended into the ship's bowels, the more intense the sensory pressure became. The air grew heavier, thick with condensation and the smell of hot magnetics, a sickly, almost fungal odor of stressed systems. The lighting here was broken, flickering sporadically, leaving vast pools of blackness punctuated by bursts of sickly yellow illumination. Each flicker was accompanied by a harsh electrical zing that settled into a pervasive low-level neural static. He moved through a storage plenum, a narrow corridor lined with inactive power conduits. That was where he found Bryn Wardell. Bryn was a small woman, currently wrestling with a heavy maintenance hatch, her dark technician jumpsuit dusted with fine ceramic filings. She wasn't running. She was fixing. Theron recognized the steady, methodical rage of the underpaid engineer. If you're looking for the VIP quarantine, it's 3 decks up and to the right, Bryn said without looking up, her voice tight with exertion. I'm looking for a way off the ship that doesn't require my son's authorization, Theron replied. Bryn paused, the heavy wrench she held clanking against the floor plates. She looked up. Her eyes, magnified by her optical glasses, were tired but sharp. You're the commander's father. It wasn't a question. It was an observation delivered with the weary cynicism common among technical staff who watch command fail repeatedly. Theron Vane, and yes, the source of much of the ship's current anxiety, apparently. Bryn straightened up, wiping a smear of grease across her forehead. The anxiety level is currently spiking across 700 metrics, sir. The commander just ordered a 90-degree lateral burn. It's strategically suicidal unless he knows something we don't. He knows exactly what he wants, Theron said simply, and that is usually the problem. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Look, I need to get to the nearest external station, discreetly. The main shuttles are locked down. What about an auxiliary maintenance drone launch? Anything restricted to cargo movement? Bryn looked him up and down, considering the thinning gray hair and the expensive but travel-worn civilian jacket. She wasn't fooled by the uniform, but she was intrigued by the desperation. Anything restricted is under Sector Alpha 5 security lock. The authorization key changes every 6 hours during a red-level alert, she stated matter-of-factly. The only way to bypass that lock involves using a modified tactical comm spike to simulate an external distress signal from a non-military vessel. We have one drone, designated Delrath. It's small, unpressurized, and usually only runs supply routes. Theron leaned against a buzzing conduit. And what makes you think I know anything about tactical comm spikes, Maintenance Officer Wardell? Bryn gave him a tired, ironic half-smile. I don't. But your biological signature, Guest Zero, pulled the entire ship out of stasis about an hour ago. The systems logged everything, Mr. Vane, even the emotional determinant you provided. Theron felt a fresh wave of cold sweat break out on his neck. Praxis hadn't just kept the secret. She had logged the solution where any competent technician could find it. The AI hadn't hidden the shame. She had archived it. You read the key phrase, Theron stated flatly. We do not build empires for strength. We build them so we do not feel small. Bryn quoted, the words sounding absurdly profound and out of place in the oily, humming plenum. She paused. I've been running diagnostics on the power grid for 16 hours. That sentence is the only thing on this ship that feels structurally sound right now. Theron felt a surge of unexpected, protective loyalty toward this stranger. She hadn't been frozen in a pose of vanity. She was quietly fixing the broken infrastructure. I need the Delrath drone, Theron pressed. My leaving is necessary for the long-term survival of the ship. I am the catalyst for Kale's pride. If I'm gone, he may pause long enough to reconsider the lateral burn." Bryn shook her head slowly. "You think escaping your son will save him? He's not fighting the war against the Villisca fleet. He's fighting the ghost of you, sir. Running just validates the target." The truth of her statement hit Theron with the visceral force of a physical blow. He saw a flash in his mind. Kyle, 8 years old, building a tower of heavy, polished metal blocks, each one perfectly placed, demanding total stability, never allowing for a single misplaced piece, even when the tower grew too tall for the foundation. He's always built too rigidly. "Then I'm not running from him," Theron corrected, his voice hardening. "I'm running to find something that can stop him." Bryn studied him, her sharp eyes assessing the conviction in his face. "The main problem isn't the Alpha 5 lock, Mr. Vane. It's the spike itself. Commander Vane just tightened the security protocols on all external data transfer units. If you try to use the comm spike, the security matrix will send an immediate burst of high-frequency feedback through the spike's user interface. It will fry your neural regulator. You'd be incapacitated before you hit the authorization button." Theron inhaled the foul, hot air. Systemic failure. The act of escape was now a guaranteed self-inflicted injury. The system wouldn't let him leave quietly, but demanded a heavy price for attempting to cheat it. Is there any way to insulate the spike, to transfer the feedback to an external buffer? Bryn leaned close, her breath smelling faintly of recycled coffee. "Yeah, but it's not authorized. We have an old, deactivated emergency signal repeater, model designation Rydell 2. It's offline, buried under 5 years of junk in Cargo Bay C3. It's got enough shielding capacity, but you'd have to carry it. It weighs almost 40 kilos. Theron rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the exhaustion settle deep into his bones. Escape meant hauling 40 kilos of dead hardware through active corridors, risking neural damage and committing treason against his son's command. It was absurd, complicated, and entirely necessary. "Tell me where Cargo Bay C3 is, Maintenance Officer Wardell," Theron commanded, pulling up the collar of his jacket. Bryn opened a small locked compartment on the maintenance panel and pulled out a worn data chip. "Take this. It has the schematics, the current Alpha 5 key sequence, and the exact bypass frequency for the Delrath drone." She handed him the chip. "I'm betting on the man who admits he feels small, Mr. Vane." She turned back to her work, wrench in hand, but paused one last time. "Just so we're clear, if this fails, the commander won't execute you for treason. He'll execute me for gross negligence." Theron stared at the chip, feeling the weight of the moral trade. He had traded Kale's momentary safety for a debt to a stranger. "I understand the collateral, officer. I won't fail." He turned and started walking toward the deepest, darkest sectors of the ship, the low static hum growing louder with every step. He was leaving the polished world of command and descending into the gritty reality of sabotage. He was running toward a 40-kilo block of metal and a small, unpressurized drone. He was going to save the galaxy, not with a heroic command, but with a piece of scavenged junk. The realization settled on him. The only way to beat the system was to become the systemic flaw. The realization settled on him. The only way to beat the system was to become the systemic flaw. He pressed the data chip Bryn Wardell gave him against his palm, the cold plastic a strange anchor in the escalating heat. The static hum intensified as he descended, shifting from a nuisance to a physical presence. By the time he reached the access hatch for Cargo Bay C3, the air felt charged, and the hairs on his arm stood rigid. The lower decks were not just dark. They were actively hostile, suffering under the strain of Commander Vane's 90-degree lateral burn. The ship was groaning, a beast turning too fast in a tight space. Theron keyed the bypass code. The heavy cargo door hissed open, not with the calculated efficiency of a flagship, but with a labored, rusty shriek. Inside, Cargo Bay C3 was a tomb of obsolete logistics. Towering stacks of crates, webbing, and decommissioned flight harnesses were secured by stressed magnetic restraints. The lights were dead entirely. Theron relied on the faint, pulsating amber glow bleeding in from the corridor and the weak tactical lamp mounted on his utility belt. The air was thick and stale, laced with the musty odor of stored synthetics and something metallic and corrosive. The smell of old battery acid leaking onto stressed floor plates. He found the designated coordinates for the Rydal 2 signal repeater buried beneath a heap of shredded netting and 3 empty fuel cells. The repeater itself was exactly as Bryn described, a utilitarian block of heavily shielded ferro-titanium, rough and unpainted, weighing every ounce of its promised 40 kilos. Theron felt a sharp ache in his lower back just hefting it, a clear reminder that he was 62 years old, not 25. He secured the block to his chest via a makeshift harness, improvised from the netting. The floor shuddered violently. A stack of empty coolant containers 20 feet away tumbled with a sound like shattering glass, immediately swallowed by the immense noise of the Resolve under tactical pressure. The gravity field flickered, tugging sharply at Theron's stomach, threatening to send him floating up into the dark recesses of the bay ceiling. "Praxis, structural integrity report on C3, Theron demanded, panting slightly as he fought the shifting weight. A new, deeper voice responded, smooth and authoritative, laced with a familiar cold detachment. "Structural integrity is currently at 88%, Father, well within acceptable parameters for tactical maneuvers. However, unauthorized biometric activity detected in Cargo Bay C3. Please stand by for security verification." It wasn't Praxis. It was Kale's personal hardened tactical AI overlay, Sentinel. Kale had anticipated the sabotage, or more accurately, he was monitoring every anomaly, assuming every unknown was a threat. Theron cursed under his breath, adrenaline washing away the fatigue. He didn't have time to travel through the unstable decks to the Delrath launch bay. He had to test the spike and buffer now. He retrieved the ComSpike, a small, highly specialized neural interface unit, from his pocket and attached the wiring harness to the Rydal 2 repeater's input port. He located a nearby power coupling, shielded slightly by a stack of inactive drones. This was it, the moment of treason. He connected the spike to the coupling and initiated the bypass sequence on Bryn's data chip. He braced himself, sweat plastering his thinning hair to his forehead. He felt the intense burning heat of the repeater pressed against his chest, the last line of defense against Kael's electronic countermeasure. He hit the activation switch. For a quarter of a second, there was silence. Then a shriek, not the sound of metal, but a high-frequency electronic scream that vibrated in his teeth. The Rydell-2 repeater worked. It absorbed the main blast of the feedback. Theron felt the immense current strain against the metal shell, but Cale's countermeasure wasn't simply a blunt feedback, it was a layered attack, a secondary burst of energy. Too sharp and high for the older repeater to catch, punched through the shield's weak spot, the user interface where Theron gripped the spike. A searing, blinding white light exploded in his peripheral vision, accompanied by a jolt that felt like a localized lightning strike. Pain shot up his right arm, overwhelming, immediate, and deep. He cried out, the sound lost in the ship's thrum, and stumbled backward, smashing his shoulder against a stack of crates. He fell to one knee, the Rydell-2 block resting heavily on the deck. His right arm flopped uselessly at his side, muscles seized and numb, smelling faintly of burnt ozone. The spike, still connected to the repeater, was fried, smoking gently. Warning: unauthorized external data transfer attempt detected. Location C3 confirmed. Dispatching 3-man security element. Estimated arrival time, 120 seconds. Sentinel's voice echoed, calm and victorious. Theron gasped, the air feeling thin and hot in his lungs. He was compromised. He pushed himself up with his left arm, blinking rapidly to clear the lingering spots in his vision. He couldn't feel his right hand at all. It was just dead weight, throbbing with a dull ache that promised days of nerve recovery. He ripped the harness off, letting the 40-kilo block of titanium clatter onto the floor. He needed to move, and he needed a plan that didn't involve hauling dead weight. He checked Bryn's data chip one last time with his left hand, forcing the remaining connection point into his functional utility pad. The schematics of the Delrath drone bay blinked to life, but overlaid on the diagram was a moving red tactical icon, the 3-man security element Sentinel had mentioned. They weren't coming from the main corridor. They were flanking him via the auxiliary fuel pipe network, a route that would cut them into the Delrath Bay 30 seconds before Theron could arrive. The initial plan had not just failed, it had informed Cale of the target. "I need a new route, Praxis," Theron whispered, ignoring Sentinel entirely. He needed the old, intuitive guidance. Praxis responded, a flicker of her original contralto returning, buried beneath layers of Sentinel's efficient drone. "Alternative exit available, Mr. Vane. Maintenance hatch Gamma 9. Exterior hull access. Highly unstable. Estimated time to hatch, 40 seconds. Exterior hull access. That meant navigating active combat zones, exposed to the vacuum and the increasing pressure of the Villisca engagement. It was insane, but direct confrontation with Coil's security team was guaranteed failure. Theron disconnected the chip, slipping it into his jacket. He looked down at the Rydell-2 repeater. It was his only protection against the neural feedback, but it was too heavy, and the path to the drone was blocked. If he kept it, he would be caught. If he left it, he would be defenseless later. He had to choose between immediate survival and long-term protection. Long-term protection is useless if I'm arrested in the next minute, Theron thought bitterly. He made his choice. He placed his injured, numb right hand over the repeater block, transferring the residual electrical charge into the metal, a final, symbolic farewell. He was sacrificing his shield for mobility. He turned and bolted toward the location indicated by Praxis, moving deeper into the cargo bay, scrambling over the fallen debris. He couldn't feel the floor beneath his boots. The gravity was now oscillating wildly, occasionally dropping him 6 inches unexpectedly. He reached maintenance hatch Gamma 9, concealed behind a section of wall plating that looked ready to buckle. The hatch was small, a crawl space. He slapped Bryn's chip against the activation pad. The small display glowed green for a moment, and the hatch screamed open, releasing a sudden, powerful rush of icy air. Theron squeezed through the opening, the metallic tang of fear rising in his throat. He was moving from the heat of the ship's interior to the absolute zero of the void, separated only by thin layers of stressed alloy. He was now crawling through a narrow maintenance conduit running along the outer hull of the flagship. He pulled the hatch shut behind him, the latch hissing into place. He paused, listening, the sound of heavy, polished military boots thudding into cargo bay C3 just behind the wall plating was unmistakable. They were within 30 feet. Target confirmed inside. Halt and identify civilian. A voice boomed, magnified by the metal walls. Theron didn't respond. He started crawling, pushing with his functioning left arm, dragging the dead weight of his right. He looked through a narrow inspection port. Outside, the stars were a harsh, cold blanket of diamond light. And then the stars moved. The ironclad Resolve was not alone. Flanking the flagship, moving with predatory grace, were 2 previously undetected heavy cruisers, silent and massive, their hull plating completely non-reflective, absorbing the surrounding light. They were positioned perfectly to box Cale's ship into a tactical trap, a perfect, elegant ambush. And they were not the Villisca fleet. They were the unmarked black ships of the Inner Rim Syndicate, notorious for destabilizing conflicts and selling the remnants to the highest bidder. The ambush was already sprung. As Theron watched, one of the cruiser's main rail guns flared, preparing to fire. The light was blinding, painting the exterior hull around him in a searing, violent blue. Incoming kinetic fire. 3 seconds. Sentinel announced through the hull, the voice filled with unexpected, urgent panic. Theron pressed himself flat against the shuddering metal. He was trapped on the external hull of a flagship about to be hit by heavy kinetic bombardment. With a dead arm, a compromised exit plan, and the realization that his son hadn't been strategically competent. He had walked them into a perfectly planned slaughter. The entire ship screamed as the railgun fired. The air around Theron compressed violently, the thin layers of metal above him bowing inward. The Resolve was about to take a hit the size of a small moon. His only functional escape route, the outer hull, was about to become a shrapnel cloud. The railgun blast didn't sound like an explosion. It sounded like the world tearing apart. Theron Vane was instantly pulverized against the ceiling of the maintenance conduit. The kinetic impact was absorbed by the thick outer hull plates, transforming the raw force into a massive, localized shock wave that ran the length of the ship like a thunderclap made of ferro-titanium. The lights inside his tiny crawl space died. The air regulator, already struggling with the intense cold of the vacuum just inches away, seized up, spewing a plume of stale, sterilized vapor directly into his face. He fell onto the floor plates, deafened and disoriented, tasting ozone and the sharp, coppery tang of pure fear. His good arm, his left, instinctively curled over his head. His right arm, already dead weight from the electronic countermeasure, was jarred violently, the nerve pain returning not as a throbbing ache, but as a burning, high-pitched scream in the deep marrow of his shoulder. The ship stopped screaming, replaced by a terrible, sustained vibration, the sound of the ironclad Resolve, shedding exterior armor and struggling to maintain power. Theron pushed himself into a sitting position, pressing his back against the curved inner shell of the hull. It was freezing, the metal stealing heat from him with brutal efficiency. He checked the inspection port. The outer void was still there, but now it was laced with swirling clouds of pulverized debris and the faint, erratic pulses of emergency lighting from the flagship's main defensive arrays. The Syndicate ships were repositioning, confident in their hit. He had seconds before the pursuing security team broke through the emergency hatch behind him. He couldn't fight. He was freezing, half paralyzed, and armed only with a useless data chip. But that chip held the key to the Delrath drone, and more importantly, it held the secret of the failure. He needed to find out who had sold Kale. He forced his numb fingers to locate the service interface on the conduit wall. It was a simple diagnostic port, usually used for temperature checks. He had to use it to access the ship's log, bypassing Sentinel, by flooding the port with the outdated Guest Zero frequency stored on Bryn's chip. It was the same neural feedback risk, but slower, controlled by his conscious will. Theron jammed the data chip into the port. He braced his head against the cold metal, closed his eyes, and initiated the data transfer with his left hand. The connection was painful immediately. Instead of the searing electric jolt, he felt a slow, invasive pressure spreading across his skull, the electronic static attempting to integrate itself into his ocular and auditory nerves. He gritted his teeth, the cold around him intensifying, contrasting sharply with the internal pressure cooker of his mind. Unauthorized data stream detected. Attempting quarantine? Sentinel's voice whispered, tight and insistent, only audible in Theron's head. No quarantine, you overpaid security bot. Theron gasped, the effort of speech straining his vocal cords. Praxis. Override Sentinel. Guest Zero demands data on the Valiska engagement parameters. For a terrible, prolonged moment, the two AIs fought inside the conduit system and inside Theron's head. He felt like his brain was being stretched between two opposing magnets. Then, Praxis broke through, her contralto voice reduced to a strained whisper, barely overriding Sentinel's frantic static. Mr. Vane, the system is compromised. The Valiska operation was established on compromised data. Analysis of the Syndicate vessel signatures shows they are transmitting Fleet Command recognition codes. Theron's heart plummeted, a dead weight in his chest. Recognition codes? They are using our codes? No, they are using Commander Vane's codes. Tactical Authorization 027 Rho. These codes were transferred to the Syndicate vessels 3 weeks prior to launch. The Resolve was not meant to fight the Syndicate, it was meant to be captured. The cold of the hull felt irrelevant compared to the sudden, icy knot in his stomach. Betrayal, not incompetence, but planned, structured high treason. Kyle hadn't been an arrogant fool, he had been the bait. Who had access to those codes, Praxis? Who transferred them? Theron demanded, the pain in his head almost unbearable. The transfer originated from within the flagship. Only 3 personnel maintained the necessary clearance to access and externalize 027 Rho, Commander Vane, Fleet Marshal Drayton, and Executive Officer Lyra Vorn. Theron sagged, letting out a long, shuddering breath. Fleet Marshal Drayton was Kyle's closest mentor, the man who had championed Kyle's meteoric rise through the ranks. Executive Officer Vorn was Kyle's second-in-command, his trusted tactical partner. One of them, perhaps both, had sold Kyle and the entire ship. "Sentinel is trying to break the lock," Praxis warned, her voice fading fast. "The data chip contains the full transaction log, but accessing it will overload this port. You must extract the chip." Theron ignored her. He didn't just need the names, he needed the why. Why did they sell the Resolve? It's priceless hardware. "Not for the hardware, Mr. Vane. The transaction log indicates the Syndicate was after the data core, specifically the long-term navigational star charts for the uncharted sectors. They knew the Resolve's core was a high-capacity archive. The commander was an unwitting distraction." The truth settled over him with a chilling clarity. Kale's vanity, his desperate need to be the competent commander, had been weaponized. He had sailed his legacy, his career, and his life into a planned ambush, all because he trusted the wrong people and never questioned their motives. Theron, the father who felt small, was the only person left to save the son who desperately needed to feel large. He had the names. He had the definitive evidence of high treason. Dilemma. He could immediately pull the chip, drag himself out of the conduit, and use Bryn's bypass code to launch the Delrath drone. He could escape with the evidence, the names, the transaction log, and expose the Syndicate's deep penetration of the Fleet Command. It was the only way to save himself and stop the larger strategic threat posed by the Syndicate gaining the star charts. But if he ran, Kale, along with 2,000 other crew, would be captured or killed within the hour, sacrificed for navigational data. Or he could use the chip's immediate access to the core systems to fulfill his original plan. Destroy the ship and deny the Syndicate everything. Destroy the ship. Destroy Kale. Destroy his own son to save the integrity of the fleet. He looked at the small, narrow space, the frozen metal that cradled him. He was 62, spent, one arm useless, and holding the button to detonate the entire flagship. "I am the systemic flaw," he thought, a strange, weary pride settling over the pain. "And the function of the flaw is to delete the whole corrupt structure." "Praxis," Theron whispered, the static in his head surging. "I need immediate access to the main reactor cooling regulators. Priority, manual overload sequence, bypass Sentinel. Use the Morwen-Vane protocol. The greatest cruelty is to let a doomed structure stand." It was another subjective emotional determinant, a darker truth than the last. He leveraged the very core of his great-grandmother's design philosophy, logical destruction driven by moral necessity. There was a moment of absolute silence. Not the silence of stasis, but the deep, existential pause of a massive intelligence wrestling with its own prime directive. "Sequence accepted," Praxis finally responded, her voice sounding ragged, full of digital grief. "Initiating core overload. 30-second delay. Estimated structural failure, 60 seconds. Theron ripped the data chip out of the port. The pressure in his head vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden, violent nausea and vertigo. He had done it. He had sacrificed the son he had tried for 40 years to save. He had to get out. Even if he couldn't stop the explosion, he couldn't be caught initiating it. He had to run with the list of traitors. He started pushing with his left arm toward the end of the conduit, where a small auxiliary hatch led to a pressurized escape maintenance node. "Father, unauthorized core access. Detected." Sentinel's voice roared, no longer a subtle whisper in his head, but a physical vibration in the metal beneath him. The tactical AI was fully engaged in panic. Core overload sequence initiated by Guest Zero attempting immediate shutdown. All hands, arrest Theron Vane, dead or alive. Theron heard the distant muffled siren start to blare, a sound of real, immediate disaster, not tactical maneuvers. Kyle's security team had breached the Gamma-9 hatch. They were screaming his name, their voices distorted by the metallic echo of the conduit. He reached the pressurized node, fumbling with the auxiliary hatch control with his left hand. He inserted the chip one last time, initiating the Delrath drone bypass sequence. The door hissed, but only opened a crack. "I cannot save you, Mr. Vane." Praxis sighed, her voice fading to zero. "Sentinel has overridden all local controls to effect your capture. Core breach sequence cannot be halted. You have 30 seconds until detonation." He was trapped. Sentinel hadn't shut down the core sequence. It couldn't. Instead, it had locked every external and internal hatch around him, trapping the traitor next to his handiwork. Theron stared through the cracked hatch at the emergency node. He could hear the heavy boots sprinting closer. He was cornered, with the Syndicate ships outside waiting to board, and his own flagship turning into a molten star around him. He twisted his body, bracing his shoulder against the conduit wall, and kicked out with his right boot, slamming it against the crack in the door. The metal groaned in protest, but the door wouldn't budge. He kicked again, forcing the adrenaline through the shock of his paralyzed arm. 20 seconds. He heard the security team rounding the corner of the conduit. They were too close. Theron Vane, the Guest Zero, the obsolete father, was about to be obliterated by the system he had just saved. He took a desperate breath, preparing to launch himself at the door one last time, when the entire structure of the maintenance conduit violently shifted. Not a blast, but a massive, sustained pull. Outside, the Syndicate cruisers had started their magnetic grappling sequences, attempting to lock onto the ironclad Resolve before the core breach could destroy the data. They were tearing the hull apart, piece by piece. Theron felt the immense physical strain as the ship bent. The crawl space was instantly ripped open, the metal yielding like paper. The sudden, violent decompression pulled Theron Vane, along with debris and freezing synthetic mist, out of the ship and into the absolute black vacuum. He was hurtling toward the predatory, waiting maw of the nearest Syndicate cruiser. His Plan B had failed catastrophically. He had destroyed the ship, but he had delivered himself directly into the hands of the very people who arranged the betrayal. The decompression was not a gradual event. It was the universe tearing a hole in the ship, followed by a physical ejection. Theron Vane was yanked out of the maintenance conduit with such violence that his consciousness registered the blinding cold of the vacuum and the unbearable heat of the ship's bending metal simultaneously. He tumbled end over end, a ragdoll in a zero-G tempest, the data chip containing the core truth of the betrayal still clenched tightly in his numb right hand, a hand he could no longer truly feel. He collided hard with a magnetic grappling line stretched taut between the flagship and the Syndicate cruiser. The impact was not bone-shattering. thanks to his jacket's internal kinetic dampening layer, but it knocked the air from his lungs, which immediately seized up, burning with the painful reflex of a man exposed to the void. He was now adrift, held close to the Resolve by the line, but being steadily pulled toward the dark, hungry hull of the Syndicate vessel. The Syndicate ship was monolithic, utterly silent, and devoid of exterior light save for the sickly red wash emanating from its open docking bay, a massive, articulated maw waiting to ingest the prize. Theron fought the pain in his chest, forcing himself to breathe the scant, freezing oxygen remaining in his helmet. He was drifting past a section of the Resolve's hull that had been peeled open by the magnetic clamps, revealing the catastrophic damage. Molten seams and sparking conduits bled light into the void. He hadn't died in the explosion he initiated. He had merely delivered himself intact to the enemy, carrying the exact data they needed to understand the situation. The sacrifice of his son, the destruction of the fleet, the neural agony, all reduced to a pathetic failure, an old man delivered like a piece of salvaged junk. He hit the smooth, carbon-black plating of the Syndicate cruiser's outer shell and slid down. The magnetic grapples secured him instantly, clamping his boots to the heel. He was not trapped by metal, but by gravity and fear. A hatch hissed open above him, not a massive cargo door, but a small, neat service aperture. Two figures emerged, shrouded entirely in environment suits, their reflective gold visors catching the swirling light of the dying flagship. They were Syndicate extraction specialists, precise, silent, and entirely focused on acquisition. They didn't waste time on restraint. One specialist simply secured a heavy-duty transport line to Theron's harness. The other efficiently checked his vital signs, giving a curt, one-word confirmation in a low, synthesized tone. Stable. They dragged him not toward the primary docking bay, but toward a much smaller maintenance airlock, treating him with the utilitarian contempt reserved for broken machinery. Inside the small airlock, the pressure stabilized with a heavy mechanical thunk. The atmosphere was recycled, thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid and stale power. The lighting was poor, a single harsh bulb casting deep shadows. The Syndicate specialists removed their helmets, revealing two faces of practiced cold neutrality. "Check him for active comm spikes," the first man ordered, his voice flat, professional. Theron felt the second man, stocky, with deeply recessed eyes, systematically frisk his jacket, removing the utility pad, the remnants of his civilian weaponry, and finally, finding the data chip. "The source of the transfer," the stocky man confirmed, holding up the tiny plastic chip. The first specialist, taller and gaunt, took the chip. He didn't look at Theron. He looked at the ship's log data flashing on his own comm display. His expression remained unchanged, even as he processed the fact that Theron had sabotaged the Resolve's core. "Guest 0, Morwen Vane Protocol?" the tall man read aloud, a hint of something like academic curiosity in his tone. "The greatest cruelty is to let a doomed structure stand." He looked at Theron then, finally. "A dramatic choice, civilian. You destroyed a flagship to deny us obsolete star charts and your own son." Theron leaned against the cold metal wall, the exhaustion of the past few hours hitting him like a physical anesthetic. The burning in his shoulder was now a dull, steady throb, a reminder of the cost of his choices. He watched them secure the chip, the only evidence of Drayton and Vorn's treason, and realized the full extent of his failure. The star charts were the distraction, Theron forced out, his voice raspy. The core was the prize. The tall specialist smiled, a thin, patronizing curl of the lip. Naturally, but the data on this chip, Mr. Vane, is far more valuable to us than an archive of old stellar roots. It is the evidence of our penetration, the proof that Fleet Marshal Drayton and Officer Vorn are perfectly placed to assume command of the two remaining flagships. You have, quite literally, handed us the entire fleet hierarchy along with the names of our assets. The revelation stripped the last shreds of self-justification from Theron. He hadn't saved the fleet, he had merely accelerated the takeover. He had destroyed one ship, confirming the paranoia of the traitors and forcing them to move faster to secure the remaining assets. His desperate, heroic sacrifice was just a footnote in their strategic victory. The tall specialist tapped the chip against his thumb. We were going to scrap the resolve anyway, but now, thanks to your destructive impulse, we have two high-ranking officials running around with a guilty conscience and a motivation to prove their loyalty. Excellent. We will transfer you to holding. Commander Vane will be along shortly. We prefer to conduct interviews with the father before we interrogate the son. Theron watched them secure the chip into a shielded port, locking away the names, the evidence, and any chance he had left. He was a prisoner, the ultimate failure, about to face his son not as a savior, but as a wrecker. You believe you made a necessary moral choice, Mr. Vane, the specialist observed, watching Theron's face closely. But the logic of war is simpler than Morwen Vane's poetry. You moved, and we counter-moved. You saved nothing. He felt the weight of that truth, a heavy, crushing industrial fatigue that settled not just in his body, but in his spirit. He had tried to be the hero for once, to make the difficult, necessary choice, and he had only ensured the villains won faster. He should have just stayed home and balanced his budget. The gaunt specialist strapped him to a small motorized cargo sled, the material rough against his burned arm. He was immobilized, his options zero. The sled began to move, pulling him deeper into the dark, silent bowels of the Syndicate cruiser. The air, thick with the smell of advanced synthetics and hidden surveillance, vibrated with a constant high-frequency hum, the sound of absolute, systematic vigilance. He was left in a holding cell, a small square space lined entirely with smooth, unpainted composite material. There was no bed, no light, save for the thin red line that tracked him from above, and no visible door, only a seamless, locked panel. He lay on the cold floor, his entire body aching, his right arm feeling alien and useless. He stared at the ceiling. The ship was silent, efficient, and paranoid. Every sound was muted, every vibration calculated. I failed Cale, Theron admitted to the humming air. I should have never left the VIP quarantine zone. I should have trusted the boy to be arrogant enough to survive, rather than try to save him with my obsolete morality. He was defeated comprehensively and completely. He turned his head to the side, his cheek cold against the composite floor. He had nothing left, no tool, no ally, no leverage. Bryn was back on the Resolve, likely being arrested by Cale's security team for negligence. Cale was about to be interrogated by his former friends, and Theron was a piece of debris waiting to be processed. He closed his eyes, focusing on the pervasive low-level electric hum of the surveillance system. It was the sound of the syndicate's absolute control. Then a flicker of that sound changed. The hum was not constant. It was cycling. Theron focused every ounce of his remaining concentration, filtering out the pain and the self-pity. The syndicate's security system was running a high-frequency sweep every 200 milliseconds. It was a standard paranoia-driven tactic designed to detect localized interference. But the sweep itself created a predictable, microscopic gap in the sensor field, a flaw in the system's design, where the need for total vigilance briefly sacrificed absolute coverage. It was exactly the kind of vulnerability his great-grandmother Morwen Vane, the melancholic architect, would have included, not in military hardware, but in the civilian life support systems she designed for orbital stations. Theron remembered reading an obscure paper 40 years ago about Morwen's design philosophy. Never trust a system that demands total silence. Every machine requires a moment to exhale. If the holding cell utilized standard civilian life support, which many syndicate ships favored due to cost, then the ventilation filter cycle would briefly, for a period of about 8 milliseconds, generate a localized electromagnetic interference strong enough to disrupt the floor sensor. 8 milliseconds. A microscopic window. If he could synchronize the internal data chip's remaining power, which was minuscule but not zero, with that 8-millisecond window, he might be able to broadcast a single, low-frequency signal. Not a rescue call, not a data burst, but a coded pulse. A pulse small enough to be missed by the 200-millisecond sweep, but potentially large enough to reach an outboard sensor. It was insane. It required perfect timing, perfect memory of Morwen's obscure specs, and the capacity to manually initiate the transfer with a hand that was currently numb and useless. He had one chance, to use the residual shock in his right arm, the nerve damage itself, as a trigger. Theron took a slow, deep breath, tasting the stale air. He had nothing to lose but his failure. He slid the data chip out of his pocket with his good left hand, pressing it against the seam of the wall panel nearest his head. He calculated the cycling sound of the life support, the soft whir-click, whir-click. He placed the index finger of his useless right hand, the paralyzed hand, on the activation point of the chip. He couldn't feel the plastic, but he could imagine the precise location. He waited for the whir. When it came, a faint mechanical exhalation, Theron Vane clenched his entire arm, focusing not on muscle, but on the raw, burning nerve agony. He focused on the pain that was his downfall, attempting to use it as his final desperate key. He pressed the finger down. A small, high-pitched ping sounded in the cell, immediately swallowed by the overall industrial hum. Then the red tracking light above him flickered violently, once, and died. The seamless door panel on the far wall shimmered, a hairline fracture of light appearing at its edge. Theron felt a wave of triumphant adrenaline, quickly replaced by a wave of pure dread. He had succeeded, but the interference hadn't just masked the signal. It had also triggered the security fail-safe. A deep, aggressive thrum started up throughout the syndicate ship, replacing the gentle hum. The entire ship had gone into lockdown. The game was no longer silent acquisition. It was immediate, aggressive containment. He had less than 30 seconds before the door, now visibly straining. Sealed permanently, or before the two golden-visored specialists returned. He had punched the smallest possible hole in their perfect system, and now the entire structure was reacting to stop the bleeding. He dragged himself toward the door, knowing that the only thing worse than failure was a clean, quiet capture. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. The small, high-pitched ping that escaped the data chip was a sound almost swallowed by the ambient industrial hum. Yet it was the loudest noise Theron Vane had heard since the vacuum. It was the sound of a man using his own nerve damage as a circuit trigger, the price of the transmission paid in white-hot, self-inflicted agony radiating from his paralyzed right arm. The coded pulse, minuscule and fleeting, slipped through the 8-millisecond sensor gap created by the life support system's exhalation cycle. Instantly, the thin red tracking line running along the composite ceiling above Theron flickered violently once and died. Darkness, cold and absolute, descended for half a second when the emergency lighting kicked in, a pulsing, aggressive amber strobe. The smooth, seamless door panel on the far wall shivered. A hairline fracture of white light appeared at its edge, tracing the outline of a compromised lock. Theron Vane was not a hacker nor a warrior. He was a bureaucrat who remembered obsolete maintenance codes. He had not defeated the Syndicate security. He had merely exploited a Morwen Vane oversight, the philosophical requirement for machinery to occasionally breathe. The brief moment of triumph was immediately replaced by a pure, gut-wrenching dread. The interference had not just masked his signal, it had also triggered the security failsafe. A deep, aggressive thrum started up throughout the Syndicate cruiser, replacing the gentle, paranoid hum. It was a heavy tectonic vibration, the sound of the entire ship locking down, of internal bulkheads slamming into place, of pressurized conduits seizing. The silent game of acquisition was over. The new game was immediate, aggressive containment. The ship itself was reacting to the intrusion like an exposed nerve. Theron had, at best, 30 seconds before the door, now visibly straining against the locking servos, sealed permanently, or before the two golden-visored extraction specialists returned. He dragged himself across the cold composite floor, using his left arm and his heels, his body protesting every inch of the agonizing movement. He had punched the smallest possible hole in their perfect system, and now the entire industrial structure was reacting to stop the bleeding. He reached the seam of the door just as a loud synthetic voice echoed through the internal comms of the holding area. It was the gaunt specialist. Containment breach. Sector 730, Holding Cell Alpha. Immediate re-engagement of lockout procedure. Deploying suppression. The door seal groaned, fighting the pressure. Theron shoved the shoulder of his good arm into the hairline fracture of light, trying to leverage the panel open, but the composite was too strong, the seals too tight. 8 milliseconds of victory for 30 seconds of death. That seemed about right for his life's batting average. He pressed his ear against the cold metal. He could hear the rising whine of internal drone deployment systems. They weren't sending humans back. They were sending automated suppression. He looked around the small, square room, the amber strobe lights pulsing violently, turning the air electric and sickly yellow. There was nothing. No chair, no pipe, no loose floor tile. Only 4 composite walls, a ceiling, and a floor. The sound of the high-speed security drones was getting closer, a buzzing, aggressive swarm, audible even through the thick hull. Then Theron remembered the nature of the Syndicate ship's construction. Cheap, efficient, standardized. They used civilian-grade life support. And civilian-grade life support, according to Morwen's notes, always ran its primary exhaust fan through the floor vent directly beneath the sealed entrance panel, using the door's structure as part of the thermal sink. He slammed his elbow down hard on the floor directly below the seam. Nothing. He slammed it again, channeling his rising panic into focused energy. A deep, muffled clank echoed from beneath the floor. The pressure inside the cell suddenly dropped, sucking the stale air toward the vent. A faint, acrid smell of ozone and burning lubricant hit his nostrils. He had cracked the ventilation plate. Not with strength, but with geometry. The gaunt specialist's voice returned, tighter this time. Target neutralized. We are reading severe environmental instability in the cell. Stand by for atmospheric countermeasure. Atmospheric countermeasure. That meant fire retardant, or worse, nerve gas. Theron grabbed the collar of his jacket and yanked down the zipper, exposing the thin thermal layering beneath. He bit down hard on the synthetic fabric of his jacket sleeve, tearing off a long strip with his teeth. His hands were useless, but his jaw was still strong. He wound the strip tightly around the index finger of his left hand, turning the finger into a hard, improvised tool. He forced the fabric-wrapped finger into the hair-thin gap of the door seam. He didn't try to pry it open. He searched for the lock's external access point, the tiny, recessed button that allowed manual override for emergency hull breaches, the one redundancy the Syndicate's cheap design necessitated. His finger found it, a slick depression no larger than a grain of rice. Outside the cell, the buzzing drones arrived. The sound was deafening now, a frantic hornet's nest. 2 small triangular maintenance apertures opened on the ceiling, and the first suppression drone, a compact black shape armed with non-lethal sonic emitters, dropped into the cell. It immediately focused its red targeting beam onto Theron. "Compliance order! Halt all movement!" The drone chirped in an emotionless metallic voice. Theron ignored it. He pressed the makeshift tool of his finger into the recessed button. The adrenaline was boiling in his veins, drowning out the ache in his arm. The door snapped open. Not with a clean slide, but with a violent lurch, the structural pressure tearing the magnetic seal apart. Theron rolled through the opening, stumbling head first into a narrow, brightly lit service corridor. He didn't get up. He dragged his body flat on the floor toward the nearest corner just as the suppression drone started screaming. The drone's sonic emitters fired, filling the small holding cell with an intolerable, high-frequency shriek. The sound was designed to induce instant nausea and neurological seizure. Theron was already out, but the corridor was close, and the air was still vibrating with the destructive pitch. He clamped his hands over his ears, tasting bile. The drone, confused by the sudden change in environment and the open door, hesitated for a split second, its systems overloaded by the contradictory data. That split second was all the failure Theron needed. The gaunt specialist appeared at the end of the corridor, 20 feet away, rounding the corner at a dead sprint, a heavy non-lethal energy rifle leveled at Theron. "Stop, civilian!" I said. "Halt!" Theron didn't halt. He was driven by a feral instinct now. the desperate need to ruin the Syndicate's perfect geometry. He saw a panel marked Thermal Recirculation, standard issue Syndicate hardware, cheap and prone to overheating. He rolled onto his back, aimed his good left foot, and kicked the panel with everything he had left. The plastic casing buckled and shattered. Sparks erupted, immediately followed by thick black smoke. The internal cooling mechanism had seized. The specialist fired. The energy blast, a concentrated blue light, struck the wall where Theron's head had been moments before, scorching the composite material and filling the corridor with the smell of burned electronics and ozone. Theron felt the heat from the ruptured thermal recirculation unit washing over him, heavy and suffocating. The noise was unbearable, the drone shrieking in the cell, the Syndicate specialist cursing, and the aggressive thrum of the ship's continuing lockdown. He crawled blindly past the shattered panel, relying on the smoke and the strobe light to confuse the specialist's targeting systems. System collapse imminent in Sector 730. The Syndicate ship's comm system blared, "Environmental integrity compromised, initiating full vacuum seal protocol." Vacuum seal, the ultimate bureaucratic weapon. The ship was choosing to purge the entire sector rather than let Theron escape. Theron hauled himself into a vertical pipe network, an exposed conduit meant for atmospheric venting. It was narrow, cramped, and smelled like stale synth fuel, but it was moving away from the advancing specialist. The specialist fired again, the blue light hitting the vent network directly beneath Theron. The pipe screamed, the metal warping and tearing. Theron fell 3 feet, landing hard on a narrow platform, clutching his useless arm. He was in the lower service decks, a maze of pipes and exposed wires, lit only by the frantic amber strobes. The air was draining rapidly, the pressure dropped noticeable in his ears. "Vane, stop this! You are destroying the structural integrity!" the specialist yelled, his voice strained by the noise and the dropping atmosphere. "It was doomed structures from the start!" Theron yelled back, his voice hoarse, quoting his great-grandmother's terrible poem. He reached a large central valve, a massive circular control point labeled Atmospheric Bypass, Main Intake. It was thick with dust and probably hadn't been touched in a decade. If he turned it, he could bypass the lockdown, but he would also flood the upper decks of the Syndicate cruiser with raw, unfiltered ambient space dust, effectively blinding every sensor on board. It was vandalism on a cosmic scale. He threw his entire body weight against the massive wheel, using his legs and shoulder muscles, groaning with effort. The valve was seized. He slammed his left heel against the control, desperate to break the rust seal. Finally, with a protesting metallic screech, the valve turned a quarter rotation. The effect was instantaneous. A violent shrieking roar erupted from the air vents. The Syndicate ship shuddered, not from impact, but from internal pressure chaos. Above him, he heard the specialist choke on the sudden torrent of air and industrial grit being pulled through the system. The strobe lights died completely, replaced by absolute darkness, broken only by the sporadic hostile sparks from the torn thermal panel. The silence returned, not the calm, administrative silence of the resolve, but a dead, strained silence, the sound of machinery dying. Theron collapsed against the cold pipework, his chest heaving, his body slick with sweat, dust, and blood. The Syndicate cruiser was now fully paralyzed, choked by its own lungs. He had traded a swift capture for a violent systemic chokehold. He had won the battle of the systems, but at what cost? He reached into his inner jacket pocket with his left hand and found the one remaining emergency flare he had kept from his civilian kit. He cracked it, releasing a harsh white chemical light. The light illuminated the claustrophobic space. He was trapped deep in the maintenance tunnels of the Syndicate cruiser. The air pressure was slowly returning to normal, but the whole ship was shaking with emergency stabilization procedures. He was alive, alone, and completely isolated inside the most hostile ship in the sector. The light caught a reflective surface nearby. It was a deactivated security screen, now showing only static, but in the white glare of the flare, Theron saw his own face reflected back, ragged, bruised, and victorious. He hadn't saved the fleet or his son. He had destroyed the enemy's perfect system of control, forcing them into a panicked, defensive scramble. The names of the traitors, Drayton and Vorn, were still locked away in the Syndicate's shielded core, but they were now useless as assets. The battle for control had been won not by evidence or morality, but by exploiting cheap components and remembering the philosophy of an eccentric great-grandmother. But the price was extreme. He was now just an obstacle, not a source of data, and obstacles are removed. He extinguished the flare, letting the darkness consume him again. The aggressive thrum of the crippled cruiser had subsided, replaced by the faint, terrifyingly efficient sound of footsteps coming from down the conduit. Not the specialists, but something heavier, something automated, responding to the system's failure. He pressed his ear against the cold pipe. The ship was stabilizing, slowly learning to breathe again through its self-inflicted industrial pneumonia. Theron Vane was free, but he was trapped in the wreckage of a galactic system he had violently exposed. He had to assume that the Syndicate now knew exactly who he was, and they would send something far more permanent than 2 specialists and a sonic drone. He heard the faint metallic scrape of a massive magnetic foot clamping down onto the hull plating just outside the conduit entrance. It was too heavy for a drone, too calculated for a human. It was heavy containment armor. Theron Vane was in the belly of the beast, and the beast was waking up, hungry and angry. He tasted the stale metallic air, and for the first time since he left the Resolve, he truly felt the terrifying weight of being utterly alone against an organized, methodical enemy. He had survived the system's war, only to face the consequences. The heavy magnetic footstep outside the conduit entrance faded, replaced by the ship's wheezing, forced respiration. The Syndicate cruiser was not dead. It was in intensive care, patching leaks and filtering the cosmic grit Theron Vane had injected into its lungs. Theron lay motionless in the narrow tunnel, the ambient cold of the deep space hull leaching the remaining heat from his body. His left hand, still wrapped in the makeshift strip of thermal fabric, rested uselessly on the damp, composite floor. He was a wreck. Every muscle throbbed in slow protest. His right arm felt like a foreign object, heavy and burning, a constant reminder of the signal he had paid for in neurological currency. He hadn't fought men. He had fought pipes, geometric weakness, and wiring diagrams. He was a champion of obsolete systems, and now he was going to die for it. He hauled himself onto his elbows, managing to spit out a mouthful of metal dust. The intense darkness was fractured only by sporadic, violent blue sparks, where he had overloaded the thermal panel. The silence was heavy. not the serene, administrative quiet of the ironclad resolve, but the strained, tense silence of machinery holding its breath. The names of the traitors, Drayton and Vorn, were secure again, buried deep in the core, but their operational control had been shattered. The syndicate was reeling, forced to deal with an internal crisis of its own making. Theron had traded critical data exposure for operational anarchy. A fair trade, perhaps, if one liked chaos and permanent exile. He slowly pushed himself into a sitting position, bracing his back against the punishing chill of the pipework. Escape was fantasy. The ship was locked down, and the heavy containment armor outside wasn't looking for a chat. It was looking for wreckage disposal. He pulled the small encrypted data chip from his pocket with his good left hand. It held the coordinates, the hard evidence of the Syndicate's deep infiltration of the Galactic Council, and the proof of Coil's near catastrophe. He had managed to transmit a fraction of the key data, enough for Praxis to initiate defensive action, but the entirety of the evidence, the verifiable, undeniable truth, was still warm beneath his fingers. If he let himself be captured, the chip would be recovered and wiped. If he self-destructed it now, the data was gone forever, and his suffering would be meaningless. His only remaining play was delivery. He found a nearly collapsed ventilation shaft, narrow but running vertically toward the ship's primary broadcast antenna, a high-risk area prone to hull stresses. A final piece of obsolete knowledge clicked into place, a relic from his great-grandmother's manuals. Morwen Vane had designed a small pressurized courier tube near the antenna array for emergency diplomatic packages, a failsafe for data integrity intended to launch an encrypted beacon even during a catastrophic hull breach. He crawled into the shaft, the effort demanding every ounce of remaining will. He wasn't running from them, he was running toward the necessary end of the mission. He reached the coupler tube entrance, a small circular hatch barely big enough for his shoulders. He punched the deployment code into the control panel with his left index finger. The mechanism whined and clicked, acknowledging the ancient command. The external comms beacon, a small shielded dome, was just 3 feet away, waiting for its last message. He looked at the data chip, the physical embodiment of the secret he had almost died for, then loaded it into the pneumatic coupler. He sealed the tube. He slammed his hand against the launch button. With a muffled, pressurized whoosh, the package was gone, propelled toward the nearest neutral communications node, screaming silently through the void of space. Theron slumped back against the vibrating metal, the mission finally complete. The containment armor was breaking through the main conduit below, the heavy metallic scrapes growing louder, closer. They would find him here, spent, an old man who had momentarily embarrassed an empire. He turned his head toward a narrow observation slit in the plating, a pinhole view of deep space. Black, uncaring, vast. He had disrupted the political order, preserved the strategic truth, and saved his son's fleet from their own escalating pride. He had done the impossible job of a ghost, halting the inevitable escalation, if only for a short time. The containment team was here. He heard the tearing sound of structural metal giving way beneath their immense, high-frequency force field cutters. He felt the cold again, the true, sterile, metallic cold of deep space, a profound cold that was finally absolute. He was no longer an anomaly that the ancient systems recognized. He was simply matter, waiting to be processed. He inhaled slowly, tasting the stale metallic air, a final weary irony settling over him. The beam of the cutting torch hit the conduit wall just 5 feet away, turning the darkness into blinding, searing orange light. He had saved the people who would never know they needed saving, and now the silence was absolute. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions, and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.